Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. He became a king, though he had never sought the throne. He fought in the Holy Land, though he could have ruled peacefully from London. He was respected even by Saladin, and his death marked the beginning of a legend. Today we will tell the story of a man whose name became synonymous with courage, Richard the Lionheart. In this video you will learn why Richard betrayed his own father, how he found himself at the very center of the Third Crusade, why Jerusalem never yielded to him, and yet glory remained his, and why his heart was buried separately from his body like that of a saint. But most importantly, you will see how a man became a legend. Richard the Lionheart, knight, king, warrior, and the symbol of an entire age. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments, and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. On the 8th of September in the year 1157 in the royal palace at Oxford, a boy was born who would go down in history as Richard the Lionheart. He became the third surviving son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who matched her husband in ambition, intellect, and influence. His birth did not cause a political sensation. The heir was considered to be the eldest son, Henry the young king, and no one yet knew what role the younger Richard would play in the destiny of the empire. Yet the blood that ran through his veins united two mighty dynasties. His father, ruler of the Angevin line, held the titles of King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. His mother, Duchess of Aquitaine, once Queen of France and later Queen of England, was a woman of exceptional power and learning. In her dowry, she brought her husband vast lands in the south of France, making him the master of a grand Anglo-Norman empire stretching from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. Richard was born into a family where politics could not be separated from personal passion. Henry II was known for his harsh temper and calculating mind, while Eleanor was independent, sharp, and determined to take part in rule. Their marriage, bound by politics, was full of conflict and rivalry. In such an atmosphere were raised their sons, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. Henry the young king received a crown during his father's lifetime, yet no authority. Geoffrey became Duke of Brittany. John was left landless, for which he earned the name Lackland, and Richard was expected to content himself with ruling Aquitaine. The future king's childhood was spent not in England, but in France, mainly in Anjou and Aquitaine. From an early age he absorbed the proud, independent, and musical spirit of the southern lands, a region famed for its chivalric customs, troubadours, and songs of love and valor, as well as for the delicate balance between overlords and vassals. Eleanor, who knew these lands better than anyone, took care to ensure her son understood their ways and could govern them wisely. Richard's education included not only knightly training, but also the study of letters. He learned Latin, history, and theology, composed poetry in the Languedoc tongue, and played musical instruments. At the same time, he was trained in warfare, fencing, horsemanship, and archery. It was all part of the formation of a prince destined to rule, and perhaps to fight. His mother played a special role in his early life. Even after Eleanor fell from favor and was placed under house arrest by her husband, she maintained her influence in the south. Richard, left in her care, became her favorite son and owed to her much of his understanding of power, culture, and dignity. She prepared him for rule, and soon he came to be regarded as the future Duke of Aquitaine. At the age of 12, his father formally granted him the title of Duke. This gesture was not only one of trust, but part of Henry's political game, attempting to balance his son's ambitions while keeping real power in his own hands. In reality, the young duke received responsibilities more than authority, pacifying barons, suppressing rebellions, negotiating with fractious lords. It became Richard's first school of governance. He learned not from books but through experience. Chronicles record that, still a teenager, he took part in quelling a baronial revolt in Saintonge. There he first encountered betrayal and the fragility of alliances, learning that military strength was only one side of rule. Politics required patience, caution, and calculation. At the same time, his poetic and musical gifts blossomed. Many contemporaries remarked that Richard composed and performed songs as skillfully as any troubadour. One of these poems, written later in Captivity, has survived and reveals his depth of feeling and artistry. This union of warrior and poet added to his charm and made him beloved among knights. By the age of 15, Richard was already a tall, striking youth with reddish hair and a piercing gaze. He was respected for his courage and blunt honesty. He had little taste for diplomatic pretense and preferred to speak his mind, a quality that impressed many in the intrigue-filled court of Henry II. While Henry the young king enjoyed hollow titles, Richard learned the reality of rule. In the south of France he found independence, strength, and purpose, no longer seeing himself as a lesser prince, but as a leader in his own right. By the time he reached manhood, he was regarded not as a younger brother, but as the Duke of Aquitaine, a man whose opinions carried weight. His destiny was taking shape, and within him grew a sense of calling that would soon bring him into open conflict with his father. In the latter half of the 12th century, the empire of Henry II Plantagenet seemed powerful and unshakable, but behind its splendor cracks were already forming. The king, who ruled England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Aquitaine, dreamed of securing his dynasty, yet in doing so he sowed discord within his family. He thought that if each son received a title and lands but not full power, he could keep them balanced. But he misjudged their pride and ambition. In the year 1170, Henry crowned his eldest son, the young king, while still alive, a gesture of symbolism, not substance. The younger Henry gained a crown, but no realm. His father kept all authority and revenues. The frustration this caused soon erupted. In 1173, rebellion broke out. Its leaders were three sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, supported by their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. The cause was the sons' demand for autonomy and resentment that their father had granted lands to John while giving nothing to them. Eleanor, angered by this injustice, tried to flee to join her sons but was captured and imprisoned for years. Richard led the revolt mainly in Aquitaine, which he already considered his own. He fortified castles, raised troops, and promised his barons freedom and support. In Poitiers, in the ancestral castle of his grandfather William X, he prepared for defense and sought aid from Paris. The French King Louis VII, Eleanor's former husband, supported the rebels, hoping to weaken English power. But Henry II's campaign was swift. He marched through Normandy, divided his sons' forces, and exploited their disunity. By 1174, the rebellion collapsed. The king forgave his sons, formally at least. Eleanor remained imprisoned. John gained lands. The elder brothers were stripped of real hope for independence. Richard returned to Aquitaine as his father's representative. There he proved both a ruler and a stern commander. In Perigord, Quercy, and Gascony, he crushed revolts without mercy. Chronicles tell of him besieging a castle, then razing it after victory to show that the duke would not tolerate defiance. His harshness angered nobles but secured order. He built fortresses, subdued vassals, and eventually earned recognition even from the old families of Aquitaine as their rightful overlord. Meanwhile, in England and Normandy, rivalries continued. In 1183, Henry the young king rebelled again, this time against Richard himself, trying to seize Aquitaine. Richard refused to yield. Henry invaded his lands but fell ill with dysentery and died at the age of 28. His death made Richard the eldest surviving son, the natural heir. Yet Henry II hesitated. He favored John, the youngest and most pliable. Realizing the danger of delay, Richard turned toward France. In 1188, he swore fealty to King Philip II Augustus as his liege lord for Normandy and Aquitaine, a move that amounted to open defiance of his father. Together with Philip, he began attacking English positions in France. At the same time, shocking news reached Europe, the fall of Jerusalem. The Christian world was shaken, and Pope Clement III called for a new crusade. Richard, knight by spirit, poet at heart, warrior by nature, was among the first to take the cross. Whether driven by faith, fame, or politics, he saw in it his destiny. But before marching east, he had to face one last battle against his own father. By the beginning of 1189, the conflict between Richard and Henry II reached its final act. After decades of tension and intrigue, it was clear that neither could yield. The aging king, weakened in body, yet unbroken in will, refused to name Richard his heir, favoring John instead. Richard, seeing no other path, strengthened his alliance with Philip II Augustus of France, young, ambitious, eager to reduce English power. In 1188, Richard swore homage to Philip for his continental lands, an act near treason but politically brilliant. Their joint campaign forced Henry to retreat, and in July of 1189, to recognize Richard as his successor. 2 days later, broken and ill, betrayed, as he believed, even by John, Henry II died at Chinon Castle. Richard was 31 years old. He became King of England, Duke of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Anjou, inheriting one of the largest realms in Europe. Yet unlike his father, he had little interest in administration. His gaze was fixed on the east. The Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, seized by Saladin in 1187, became his sacred goal. The Crusade promised both glory and salvation. His coronation took place on the 3rd of September 1189 at Westminster Abbey, with all the grandeur befitting a Christian monarch. Dressed in purple, he took solemn oaths before archbishops, bishops, nobles, and knights. But the day was marred by tragedy. Fearing accusations of sympathy with Christ killers, Richard had ordered that no Jews attend the ceremony. Some came nonetheless bearing gifts and were violently driven away. The next day, anti-Jewish riots erupted in London, houses were looted, families murdered. Richard ordered the violence stopped and the ringleaders punished, yet pogroms spread to other cities. It was a dark beginning for his reign. Almost immediately, he confirmed his vow to join the Third Crusade. His allies were King Philip II and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had already set out but soon drowned while crossing a river in Asia Minor. His army dispersed, leaving the burden of leadership to Richard and Philip. Preparing for war required immense funds. Richard sold everything that could bring money: lands, titles, offices, charters. He joked that he would have sold London itself if he could find a buyer. The chief revenue came from the Saladin tithe, a 10% tax on all incomes, even from the clergy, to finance the crusade. Though unpopular, it filled the royal treasury and built one of the best-equipped crusader armies in history. In his absence, Richard appointed William Longchamp, Bishop of Ely, as regent. Loyal but disliked, Longchamp faced hostility from nobles and from Prince John, who swore allegiance but clearly plotted for power. Richard, aware of the danger, nonetheless pressed on. In the spring of 1190, he left England, crossed the Channel, and gathered his fleet in southern France. In August, he met Philip at Vézelay, where they renewed their alliance before sailing separately. Richard to Marseille, then Sicily. There, he met his first test. The island's ruler, Tancred, refused to release Richard's sister Joanna, widow of the late King William of Sicily, and to pay her dowry. In September 1190, Richard seized Messina by force, displaying his military might. Tancred yielded, freeing Joanna and paying compensation, but the campaign strained his alliance with Philip, who disapproved of his aggression and soon sailed on alone. Richard stayed in Sicily until the spring of 1191, then departed. A storm scattered his fleet, and several ships wrecked on the shores of Cyprus. The island's ruler, the usurper Isaac Comnenus, denied aid to survivors. Richard responded swiftly. He landed, defeated Isaac's forces, captured him, and took control of the island, a valuable base for his army. On the 12th of May, 1191, on Cyprus, Richard married Berengaria of Navarre, accompanied by his sister Joanna. The ceremony took place in Limassol. Though there was little affection between them, the union was politically sound, securing an alliance with Navarre and a proper queen for England. Yet Berengaria never came to England and played no role in its affairs. In early June 1191, Richard left Cyprus for Acre, the besieged city held by Muslim defenders and surrounded by Crusader forces. There Philip awaited him, along with warriors from across Europe. Ahead lay the battles that would make Richard the Lionheart a legend for centuries to come. When in June of 1191 Richard's fleet reached the shores of the Holy Land, the siege of Acre had already lasted for almost 2 years. The city, the most important port of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, was held by a Muslim garrison, yet the Crusaders gathered from across Europe had long been unable to take it. King Philip II of France had arrived earlier. His forces camped before the walls, but the siege dragged on, and the camp was ravaged by disease, heat, and the lack of coordinated command. The arrival of Richard the Lionheart, well prepared and with a battle-ready army, brought fresh order and resolve to the besieging host. In the first days after landing, Richard focused on strengthening the camp's defenses, organizing supply lines, and scouting positions. He inspected the environs in person, ordered new siege engines to be built, enforced discipline within his ranks, and quickly brought his army to fighting readiness. His troops, English, Norman, and mercenary contingents, were well-trained and obedient. Their presence raised the morale of all the Christian forces. Sensing that Richard's arrival diminished his primacy, Philip II soon distanced himself from active participation in the siege. After several weeks of formal cooperation, he returned to France, leaving a small detachment under the Duke of Burgundy. Thus, command effectively passed to Richard, and it fell to him to bring the operation to an end. Richard acted with energy. He repaired and strengthened the siege works, put the throwing machines in order, and raised new towers. Under his direction, catapults bombarded the walls daily, while sappers tunneled beneath the bases of towers under the cover of pavessees and archers. He himself often appeared at the front, spoke with the engineers, and even helped aim the engines. Chronicles note that his personal involvement instilled confidence in common soldiers and inspired the knights. The siege advanced slowly, but surely. In early July, Acre's walls began to crumble. The defenders, no longer hoping for relief, offered to capitulate. According to the agreement, they were to surrender the city, hand over the relic of the True Cross, return about 1,500 Christian captives, and pay a substantial ransom. In return, Richard was to spare the garrison. The city yielded on the 12th of July, 1191. Saladin, who was nearby with the main body of his army, confirmed his assent to the terms, yet he delayed their fulfillment. Throughout the following month, he neither delivered the prisoners, nor paid the gold, nor returned the relic. Richard sent envoys and extended deadlines, but by late August his patience was exhausted. Within sight of Acre's walls, where Saladin could observe what was happening, Richard ordered the execution of about 2,700 Muslim captives. It was a deliberate display of resolve. The king believed that failure to honor the pact endangered trust in any future negotiations and undermined the authority of the Christian camp. The organized public execution horrified and scandalized some allies, but Richard remained unshaken in his decision. He did not linger after taking Acre. He strengthened the garrison in the city, secured supplies, and began preparing to march along the coast toward Jaffa. This route was chosen with care. Advancing by the shoreline allowed naval support and avoided a deep thrust into the interior of Palestine, where Saladin's army could force less favorable terms of battle. The Crusader column moved slowly, under a blazing sun, in constant readiness for attack. On the 7th of September, 1191, as the army marched in battle order along the woods between Caesarea and Arsuf, the assault began. Saladin's forces fell upon the rearguard. Arrows, shouts, swift cavalry raids. The Muslim warriors struck, vanished, and returned again, seeking to disrupt the formation. Richard had prepared his commanders in advance. Infantry marched in tight columns, the knights were ready to blunt charges, and the crossbowmen shielded the flanks. He waited, refusing to be drawn into a rash engagement. When the pressure mounted and the Templars, likely on their own initiative, countercharged, Richard did not recall them. Seeing an opening, he ordered a general advance. In the center of the line, he personally took command of the heavy cavalry and led it in a breakthrough. The blow was crushing. The Muslim army wavered, tried to regroup, and then, driven by the weight of armored horse, began to fall back. The fields of Arsuf were strewn with the bodies of hundreds of fallen warriors, and for the first time since the Crusade began, the Christians won a clear victory in open battle. The Battle of Arsuf proved a turning point. It showed that the Christian army could fight in disciplined fashion, endure the enemy's strikes, and deliver its own. The victory raised morale, cemented Richard's position as the unquestioned leader of the expedition, and provided a new strategic foothold, the city of Jaffa, which the army soon reached. There, Richard spent several weeks strengthening the defenses, arranging supplies, and preparing for the next stage, the march on Jerusalem. Yet before he could move on the holy city, he had to reckon with a hard truth. Victory on the field was not always enough to secure the ultimate goal. Ahead lay not only battles but arduous negotiations, for across the desert stood a ruler unbroken by defeat and too wise to grant his enemy another easy chance. After Arsuf and the capture of Jaffa, Richard the Lionheart's campaign entered a new phase. Military action yielded to a subtler contest, diplomacy. His chief adversary remained Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in Europe as Saladin, who not only commanded one of the strongest armies in the Islamic world but also possessed authority stretching from Egypt to Syria. He was a seasoned commander, a devout Muslim, and a statesman able to reconcile competing interests of rulers and tribes. Despite the reverse at Arsuf, Saladin was far from defeated. His forces remained effective, the fortresses of central Palestine stood firm, and his army's morale endured. He understood that the front had stabilized, yet the threat of an assault on Jerusalem was growing more real. Richard, for his part, saw that the Christian host was weary, its numbers shrinking, and supplies more precarious the farther it moved inland. Thus began a series of negotiations in which far more was at stake than a mere exchange of terms. Unlike some Western barons, Richard treated Saladin with respect. He did not regard him as a barbarian or infidel to be despised, but as an equal, a ruler waging war for faith and political duty. This respect colored the tone of messages and diplomatic formulas. There were no curses, no venom, no arrogance, only firmness, perseverance, and a clear recognition of a formidable opponent. Saladin responded in kind. He admired Richard's personal courage and noted his fairness in battle, his simplicity in daily life, and his straightforwardness at the bargaining table. In Muslim chronicles, he appears as Malik an-Nuja, the Night King. They spoke of a man who ate the same food as his soldiers, slept in field conditions, did not complain of hardships, and demanded no luxuries. Such restraint inspired respect even among his enemies. Over the course of prolonged talks, a tone emerged that chroniclers later called mutual nobility. Although they never met face to face, a constant diplomatic channel connected them, through emissaries, clergy, translators, and even family members. Legend has it that a dynastic union was once mooted, that Saladin supposedly proposed marrying his brother to Richard's sister Joanna so that Jerusalem might be granted to both as a symbol of unity. Historians, however, consider this a later invention. Chronicles from the time of the Crusade record no such concrete plan. Even so, diplomatic courtesy was accompanied by tangible gestures. When Richard fell ill, likely with malaria or typhus, Saladin sent him a physician and baskets of ice and fruit. When a Muslim commander lost his sword, Richard returned it via intermediaries. These episodes were not displays of friendship, but reflections of a code of conduct among rulers eager to show not only strength, but personal cultivation. Meanwhile, the fighting did not cease. Richard remained active. He strengthened Jaffa's defenses, launched raids, seized individual strongholds, and in February of 1192, advanced to the very approaches of Jerusalem. The army reached heights from which the holy city was visible, but Richard refused to storm it. He understood that even if Jerusalem were taken, holding it without solid fortifications, ample supplies, and constant reinforcement by sea would be impossible. The papal objective, to restore the Holy Sepulchre, receded before strategic reality. A second advance on Jerusalem followed in the summer of the same year. Yet again, despite pressure from knights, clergy, and allies, Richard declined an attack. The decision was painful. It caused discontent in the camp and argument among commanders, but it preserved the army. Richard chose to husband strength for negotiations rather than squander it on an assault that would be followed by a forced evacuation. For his part, Saladin reinforced fortresses, held the line, and increasingly inclined toward a settlement. Muslim resources were stretched, recent victories could not offset all losses, and reserves were dwindling. He needed to keep Jerusalem, but he knew that without an accord, there would be another invasion, another siege. In September of 1192, the parties concluded an agreement. It was not called a peace, yet it effectively ended the war. The coastal towns from Jaffa to Tyre remained under Christian control. Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed free access to the holy places. The truce was set for 3 years and 8 months. Chronicles relate that after the pact was sealed, the two leaders exchanged gifts once more, a hunting falcon from one side, a silk garment from the other. They never saw each other in person, but each knew he had faced a worthy foe. Their relationship became a symbol not only of military rivalry, but of a rare mutual respect between enemies, remembered in both East and West. Thus concluded one of the most renowned episodes of the Third Crusade. The war yielded neither decisive victory nor total defeat. It left instead the abiding image of two men, not merely warriors, but sovereigns who grasped both the price of peace and the meaning of honor. When in October of 1192, Richard left the shores of the Holy Land, he left behind not only battles, camps, sieges, and diplomatic parleys, but also years that had reshaped his fate and Europe's. He departed Jaffa with a sense of duty fulfilled. Though Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, the honor of the cross was upheld, the coastline secured, and pilgrims guaranteed access to the shrines. Now the king had to return home, to an empire he had not seen for nearly 4 years, where enemies were already stirring and where his name meant hope to some and menace to others. He sailed, but a violent storm scattered his escort, and the ship bearing the king was driven onto the Adriatic coast, near lands held by the Babenbergs, the Dukes of Austria. With one of them, Leopold V, Richard already had a quarrel remembered by both sides. During the siege of Acre, after the city's capitulation, Leopold had raised his banner beside royal standards, an act Richard took as presumptuous vanity. On his orders, the Austrian flag was torn down and cast from the tower. For the proud duke, it was a public humiliation he did not forgive. Sensing the danger, Richard chose not to cross Europe with royal insignia. Disguised as a merchant and traveling under an assumed name, he headed toward the German lands, hoping to pass incognito. The journey failed. Near Vienna, at the end of December of 1192, he was recognized. According to one tale, a servant, unable to shed courtly habits, aroused suspicion by purchasing an expensive glove or an overly splendid belt. Whatever the cause, Richard was seized by Duke Leopold's men and confined in Dürnstein, a grim fortress perched on a crag above the Danube. From that moment, his fate lay in his enemies' hands. The Duke of Austria had no formal right to hold a king, but he soon handed his prisoner over to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire. Hostile to Anglo-Norman influence on the continent and eager to strengthen his own position, the emperor saw in Richard a hostage who could yield both political leverage and immense sums of money. The capture caused a sensation. News spread quickly through Europe, alarm in England, rejoicing in France, and lively scheming at the court of John Lackland. Richard's younger brother, long covetous of the crown, did not conceal his ambitions. He cultivated ties with Philip II Augustus, hoping with French support to seize power. From France came proposals to the emperor. Do not release Richard, keep him confined as long as possible, and in exchange receive gold and political concessions. A political crisis erupted in England. The regents appointed by Richard lost authority. Barons wavered. The people were anxious. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the king's mother, immediately entered the fray. Despite her age, she advocated tirelessly, writing to Rome, to the emperor, to Pope Celestine III, arguing that the arrest of a Christian king was sacrilege and a violation of church law. The Pope heeded her words and excommunicated Duke Leopold for his role in the seizure, but it did not change the captive's plight. Meanwhile, Emperor Henry VI demanded a ransom, 100,000 marks of fine silver, roughly equal to 3 years of the English crown's revenues. A second installment, another 50,000 marks, was stipulated in case of delay or in return for political concessions. Raising such a sum was a colossal task. A special levy was proclaimed in England. Churches surrendered chalices and vestments. Monasteries gave up treasures. Common people turned in silver coins and ornaments. A realm barely recovered from the taxes of the Crusade now paid again, this time to redeem its king. Richard spent almost 1.5 years in captivity. He was held first at Dürnstein, then at Trifles in the Palatinate. His conditions were not the harshest, but neither were they privileged. He lived under guard, had little freedom of correspondence, yet according to some chroniclers, kept his spirits high. Rumor had it he composed songs in the Occitan tongue and sang them to the lute, and that his loyal troubadour, Blondel, once found him by singing a familiar melody beneath every stronghold's walls. The tale became a lovely emblem of fidelity, though historians deem it a later literary flourish without documentary proof. By the spring of 1194, most of the ransom had been gathered. Satisfied, the emperor agreed to release his prisoner. On the 4th of February, Richard was freed and, escorted by his intimates, set out for home. He crossed France under guard, met his mother, and by March reached England, where he was greeted with joy and relief. His regalia were restored at once. He reaffirmed his rights to the throne, summoned his council, and began preparing for the next chapter of his life. Yet homecoming did not end his troubles. Waiting for him stood a brother who had dreamed of usurpation, and a king of France with whom a new war was now inevitable. And Richard himself, the man who had journeyed from coronation to captivity, would again have to prove that the name Lionheart belonged not only to legend, but to a living ruler able to keep a crown upon the edge of a sword. When Richard the Lionheart set foot on English soil in the spring of 1194, he was greeted not only with joy, but with unease. The realm awaited its king, yet did not know in what state he would return, a weary captive or a commanding sovereign. He arrived at the port of Southampton in early March and almost at once went to Winchester, where his second coronation took place. This act, more symbolic than political, was needed to emphasize unbroken legitimacy, and to show that, despite captivity, royal authority had not lapsed. Richard did not linger in England. He remained in the kingdom only a few weeks, during which he reaffirmed his rights to the throne, convened the barons, placed loyal men in key offices, and levied fines on traitors. His brother John, implicated in conspiracy and ready for usurpation, was publicly forgiven, likely for reasons of state, yet stripped of real influence. Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine continued to play a major role in governance, especially in the southern provinces where her authority remained unshaken. France again became the king's chief concern. He left England in May of 1194, crossed the Channel, and soon was back on the fields of Normandy, where hard, stubborn fighting with King Philip II Augustus of France was underway. During the years of Richard's captivity, the French crown had strengthened its position, seized several key towns, and won over some Angevin and Manceau barons. What had begun as a defense of Plantagenet inheritance was turning into a full-scale war for the political balance of Western Europe. Richard showed he had forgotten neither strategic judgment nor knightly dash. He personally led campaigns, restored castles, reinforced garrisons, forged temporary alliances, and, when needed, struck unexpectedly at the enemy's rear. Diplomacy revived under him. Envoys went to the Dukes of Brittany, the Counts of Toulouse, even to the German Emperor, to secure either support or neutrality. Throughout the conflict, he displayed remarkable endurance and clarity of purpose to hold Normandy, recover Anjou and Maine, and prevent Philip from driving the English off the continent. One emblem of this struggle was Château Gaillard, the saucy castle, as the English called it. Construction began in 1196 and was completed 2 years later. Raised on a cliff above the Seine, at a strategic point between Rouen and the French royal frontier, it became not merely a fortress, but a challenge flung at Philip. Richard personally oversaw the work, chose the site, approved the designs, and, according to chroniclers, visited the building site daily. He invested not only the treasury but his reputation in the project. Château Gaillard was to be a bastion that would halt the foe and proclaim that the English had come to the continent to stay. The castle embodied the newest defensive ideas: a complex system of walls, concentric works, inner bastions, water defenses, and stone bridges. It was the first time in Western Europe that a fortress's architecture had been planned so rigorously for war. Its cost was great, but Richard deemed it essential. On one occasion he exclaimed, "If these walls were made of butter, I would still hold them." The phrase, recorded by chroniclers, became a symbol of his resolve. Alongside war and building, Richard pursued active internal policy. He redistributed lands, strengthened ties with vassals, restored ecclesiastical rights, and supervised trade. In Normandy, he appointed judicial commissions to curb abuses. He also reformed taxation in his French domains to finance the war. Though he had no heirs, he shaped a system meant to preserve continuity of rule. Eleanor remained his chief confidant in the southern reaches of the empire. By 1198, Richard again controlled most of the territories lost during his captivity. Philip II suffered several reverses, was forced to retreat, and to sign temporary accords. Yet Richard did not intend to pause. He knew that final victory required not only battles, but the elimination of internal pockets of resistance. In the spring of 1199, he led a brief campaign in Limousin, where a local baron, Aymery Vasco de Chabrol, refused to recognize royal authority and had fortified himself in his castle of Châlus-Chabrol. Rumor held that a great treasure was hidden within the walls, and Richard, expecting a swift and profitable operation, arrived with limited forces. He anticipated little resistance, but the siege dragged on, and during one evening tour of the lines, on the 26th of March, the king was struck by a crossbow bolt. This event set in motion the story we will tell in the next chapter, the tale of the last effort of a man whose heart truly belonged not to the throne, but to the field of battle. In the spring of 1199, the siege of Châlus-Chabrol in Aquitaine began as a local punitive expedition against a rebellious vassal, Aymery, Pierre in some tellings, de Chabrol. King Richard, in the midst of his protracted struggle with King Philip II Augustus of France, sought not only to stamp out resistance but also to seize the treasures said to be hidden in the castle. Though the target seemed minor, this siege became the last of Richard I's life. On the 26th of March, during an evening inspection of the positions, Richard, as so often, stood near the forward posts with little guard. From the ramparts, a crossbowman loosed a bolt that struck the king in the left shoulder, by some accounts in the axillary area. At first the wound seemed harmless. The king did not lose consciousness, remained composed, and allowed treatment at once. But in extracting the bolt, the court surgeon caused further damage, and the wound soon festered. Gangrene set in. The king was carried to a tent where his condition steadily worsened. As swelling and fever mounted, Richard understood the inevitable. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, came quickly despite her advanced age. She spent his final days at his side, hearing his instructions, comforting him, and remaining with him to the end. Chroniclers say the king kept his mind clear to the last, drew up his will, named his younger brother John as his successor, and ordered that the crossbowman who had shot him be pardoned. The archer's name survives in the chronicles, Peter Basile. According to the tales, he was a youth acting on his own, without his lord's command. When Richard learned this, he supposedly said, "Let him go. He has fulfilled the will of God." Yet after the king's death, the commander of the siege, the Captain Merchedier, ordered a brutal execution of Pierre despite the royal pardon. Richard died on the evening of the 6th of April, 11 days after he was wounded. His last words, chroniclers report, were addressed to his mother. "Do not weep, mother, for I die as a king." The line may be legend, but it has sunk deeply into the image of a monarch meeting death with dignity. By his will, Richard's body was interred in separate parts. His heart, as a token of fidelity to Normandy, was sent to Rouen, the capital of his continental domains, and laid in a silver shrine in the cathedral. His entrails were left at Chalus, a sign that here his life had ended. His body was carried to the Abbey of Fontevraud, beside the remains of his father, Henry II, and later his mother, Eleanor. There, in the Abbey's great hall, their effigies were set, father and son reunited after death despite years of political and personal strife. Richard's death had not only personal but historical weight. His brother John Lackland, who became king, proved weaker and less resolute, and could not hold the vast Anglo-French empire built by Henry II and strengthened by Richard. Within a few years of the Lionheart's death, most of the continental territories fell under the French crown. Richard's passing symbolically closed an era, knightly, impetuous, founded on personal bravery and the authority of the individual, yet his memory did not fade. Already in the 13th century, troubadours sang ballads of the Crusader king, and chroniclers fashioned a romantic image of a warrior, poet, and just ruler. One of the most popular legends told of the faithful minstrel Blondel, who searched for the captive Richard through Europe's castles, singing their shared song beneath each tower until he heard a familiar voice answer. Almost certainly a fiction, the story nonetheless became part of Richard's image, the king whom memory could not relinquish. In English remembrance, Richard remained the embodiment of the chivalric ideal, strong, generous, and brave. Despite the fact that he spent much of his reign away from England, seldom visiting the island, his figure was celebrated as a symbol of national greatness. Later, from the later Middle Ages onward, he became inseparable from the legends of Robin Hood, the just monarch whose return restores order. His likeness was used in heraldry, art, literature, and even politics as a standard of royal courage. Centuries passed with Richard's body resting quietly at Fontevraud, while his heart became an object of veneration. In the 19th century, during restoration work in the cathedral at Rouen, the casket containing his heart was opened, and within lay the dried but preserved organ surrounded by aromatics, incense, botanical traces, and silver dust, exactly as Christian martyrs were buried. Scholars confirmed the authenticity of the find, and once more voices spoke of Richard not merely as a ruler, but as a legend. Thus ended the life of Richard I, called the Lionheart, a man whose fate united poetry and policy, severity and generosity, victories and losses. He did not die in battle, yet with a weapon in his hand, and to his final breath remained true to himself. His throne passed to his brother, but his name endured through the ages, an echo of a time when the sword could outweigh the crown, and a king's word was stronger than stone.